Ruth Harper stood in her dimly lit kitchen, staring at the coffee pot like it was a stranger. Her hands, once strong and capable, trembled slightly as she reached for the chipped white mug with the faded cardinal on the side. The sunlight filtered weakly through the curtains, casting long, golden bars across the scratched linoleum floor. Outside, a lawn mower buzzed somewhere, distant and relentless, like time itself, always moving, never asking permission. She took a sip and grimaced. Cold. Again. It was just one of those small things, the tiny betrayals of everyday life that piled up until they whispered something cruel: "You're fading. You're no longer necessary." At 68, Ruth felt it in her bones, the slowness, the stiffness, the silence. Not the good kind of silence either. Not peace. Just absence. Her husband had been gone 2 years this week. Stroke. Fast. Just like that. Her daughter, Carrie, called every other Sunday, always with a strained voice, like she had to mentally prepare herself to talk to her own mother. "You doing okay, Mom?" And Ruth always lied, "Of course, sweetie." But this morning, something shifted. Not in her body, not in her heart, on the screen. As she opened her tablet to scroll through the morning news, a red breaking news banner jolted across the screen: Musk unveils device that could reverse cognitive aging. World leaders concerned. She blinked. Tapped it. The video buffer spun, then loaded. Elon Musk stood on a circular stage, dressed casually in black jeans and a SpaceX hoodie, speaking in that calm, mechanical cadence that somehow still managed to inspire millions. "We're not here to fight age," he said. "We're here to redefine it. To stop accepting that being older means being obsolete. Neuraleaper isn't about vanity. It's about possibility." Ruth stared, her mouth slightly open. The device itself looked almost comical, like a sci-fi headband with chrome nodes and blinking lights. According to Musk, it stimulated dormant neural pathways, reigniting parts of the brain long thought irrecoverable. Early trials showed cognitive clarity returning in patients over 70. One woman reportedly remembered the piano piece she'd played as a girl, and then played it, note for note. Governments were pushing back. Ethical concerns. Safety regulations. Slippery slope, one headline warned. Dangerous tech in vulnerable hands, said another. Ruth didn't care about any of that. All she could think about was the piano. She hadn't written in decades. Her novel, the one she'd begun when Carrie was a toddler, sat buried in a drawer, half a chapter long. Her husband, Tom, used to beg her to finish it. "You've got something to say, Ruthie," he'd whisper when the world got quiet. But time had swallowed her courage. Until now. She found herself whispering Musk's words out loud, as if testing how they felt on her tongue: "Stop accepting that being older means being obsolete." Could it be true? Could this really be the spark she didn't know she was waiting for? She reached for her glasses and hit play again. There was something electric about the way he talked, not just about tech, but about belief. He made risk sound like purpose. Made fear feel optional. And beneath it all, there was that unmistakable tone of defiance. Not anger, not arrogance, just refusal. Refusal to let the world stay the way it was. Ruth felt her pulse quicken, a tingling in her fingers. A fire, faint but real. She tried to remember the last time she had felt genuinely curious about something. The last time she had felt more than just existing. Her mind drifted to a moment from long ago. Carrie was 5, sitting on the floor of the library where Ruth had worked for 27 years, folding paper cranes while Ruth shelved books. A boy had walked past and whispered, "Your mom's old." And Carrie, without missing a beat, replied, "She's not old. She's a story." Ruth hadn't thought of that in years. Not until now. That's what Elon was talking about, wasn't it? Stories. Not endings. Not decline. Just new chapters we've been told we can't write. She shook her head, almost laughing. What was she thinking? She was nearly 70. She didn't even like new tech. Her hearing aids still gave her trouble. And yet, there it was again. The spark. The part of her that still wanted. That still reached. Maybe it wasn't about the device. Maybe it was about the question. What if she wasn't done? What if all the things she'd labeled as too late were just waiting for her to change the label? She looked out the kitchen window. The neighborhood hadn't changed much in 40 years. Same oaks. Same mailboxes. Same sense of quiet acceptance. But something inside her had shifted. Something quiet but undeniable. Her hand, still trembling slightly, reached for a pen. She grabbed the old notepad from the fridge, grocery lists, phone numbers, random scribbles. At the top, in shaky cursive, she wrote one sentence. What if everything I believed about getting old was wrong? Then below that, almost as an afterthought, she wrote the second line, hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? She stared at it. It felt ridiculous. It felt thrilling. She wasn't sure what she was going to do with it. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. Maybe that was the point. The kettle began to hiss behind her, snapping her out of the moment. She turned it off, poured herself a fresh cup of coffee, and sat at the table with the notepad in front of her. The sun had risen just a little higher, painting the walls a warmer shade of gold. Somewhere deep inside, a door had opened. She didn't know where it led. But for the first time in a long time, she wanted to find out. Ruth Harper had once believed that life moved in neat chapters, each one closing gracefully before the next began, like the books she used to shelve in the children's section of the Midway Public Library, but life had not closed its chapters neatly for her. It had torn pages out, skipped paragraphs, and left unfinished sentences scattered across the years, and now at 68, she sat in a life that felt like a book left open in the rain, water-stained and unreadable, with no one around to turn the page. Her days had become a rotation of small tasks that made her feel productive but hollow: feed the birds, wipe the counter, call the pharmacy, sweep the front steps, all of it done with a quiet competence that masked the loneliness gnawing at the edges of every hour. Tom had died on a Thursday. She remembered that not because it mattered which day it was but because the doctor had said it like it was an appointment they'd missed. Massive stroke, sudden, nothing to be done, and just like that the man she'd shared 43 years with was a memory, and not even a clear one. She'd always thought there would be a last conversation, one final, I love you, or, remember when, to cling to, but he had collapsed by the garage with a bag of birdseed in his hand, and that was it. No warning, no goodbye, just silence. The weeks after his death were a blur of casseroles, cards, and soft-voiced condolences that never really reached her. People said things like, he had a good life, and, you were lucky to have him, as if luck softened the blow, as if gratitude could replace presence. But what haunted Ruth wasn't just his absence, it was the way her world seemed to rearrange itself without him, subtly and cruelly. People stopped calling as often. Invitations dwindled. The women at church smiled with pity instead of joy. Her own daughter, Carrie, visited less, citing work and kids and the distance, always the distance, even though she lived just 40 minutes away in Bloomington. The truth was harder to admit, they hadn't been close for years. There had been love once, fierce and unshakable, when Carrie was a little girl with tangled hair and a wild imagination, but somewhere along the way that closeness frayed. Maybe it was after Carrie's divorce, maybe after Ruth's refusal to move in with her, or maybe it was just the way adult relationships calcify when no one waters them. Ruth missed her daughter more than she ever said out loud. And then there was the book. Her book. The one she started writing when Carrie was 3, when Tom bought her a second-hand typewriter and said, I think there's a story inside you, Ruthie. Let it out. She remembered that day so clearly. The afternoon light spilling across the dining table, Carrie drawing on the floor with crayons, and Ruth hunched over the clunky keys, typing the first words of what was meant to be a sweeping story about a woman discovering her worth in a forgotten town. She had written 30 pages before doubt crept in, whispering that she wasn't really a writer, that her words didn't matter, that no one would read it anyway. She tucked the manuscript into a manila folder, slid it into the bottom drawer of her nightstand, and promised herself she'd come back to it when life settled down. But life never settled. There was always something: work, school meetings, doctor appointments, funerals. The years passed like scenery outside a train window, fast and blurry and just out of reach, and now that folder sat in the same drawer, unopened for decades, the ink probably faded, the paper yellowing. Sometimes she'd glance at it like it was a photograph of someone she used to know, a younger version of herself full of ideas and hunger. She missed that version of herself. The house, too, had grown quieter with each year. The rooms echoed in a way they hadn't before, the creaks in the floorboards becoming companions, the ticking of the wall clock sometimes louder than her thoughts. The kitchen smelled like lemon and wood polish, always clean but never warm. The living room held a thin layer of dust on the unused cushions. Her bed, once shared, now felt like an ocean of cold fabric. She tried to fill the void with routine. Monday was laundry. Tuesday was errands. Wednesday she drove to the grocery store even when she didn't need much, just to be around people. Thursday was library day, though she rarely checked out more than a magazine. Friday she'd allow herself a treat, usually a slice of carrot cake at the diner, eaten slowly while she watched people come and go. Saturday was her call with Carrie, and Sunday was church, where she sat in the same pew she'd shared with Tom, listening to sermons about hope and grace and eternity that didn't feel quite as solid as they used to. Her body was beginning to betray her. The knees ached more each morning, her grip had weakened, and she sometimes lost words mid-sentence, fumbling for them like they were objects dropped in the dark. Her doctor told her it was normal, just part of aging, as if normalcy made it bearable. "Slow down, Ruth," he'd said at her last appointment. "Take it easy." But taking it easy felt like surrender. She didn't want to slow down. She wanted to feel something again. Wanted to wake up with purpose, not just a checklist. She wanted to matter. And yet, she'd stopped believing that was possible. That morning, before the Musk announcement, she'd sat in the recliner with a cup of tea cooling beside her, staring at the birds outside the window and wondering, not for the first time, how it would feel to disappear. Not dramatically, not tragically, just fade. Like a photo left in the sun. Would anyone notice? Would anyone care? Would Carrie feel guilty or relieved? She had brushed the thought away quickly, ashamed of it, but it lingered in the back of her mind like a cold draft. And then, that broadcast. That moment. That sentence, "Stop accepting that being older means being obsolete." It didn't feel like an advertisement. It felt like a challenge. A dare. Something in her heart had stirred. She remembered how her chest had tightened, not with fear but with recognition. Musk wasn't talking about tech. He was talking about rebellion, the rebellion against invisibility, against giving up, against believing that the best parts of yourself were behind you. Ruth had never been rebellious. She'd followed rules, kept her head down, done what was expected. But maybe that was the problem. Maybe what she needed now wasn't more rest but more risk. Maybe the years she had left weren't a slow drift toward the end, but an opening, a doorway. Maybe she wasn't too old to change. Maybe she was finally old enough to know exactly why she had to. She looked across the room to the drawer where the manuscript still lived. She hadn't opened it in 35 years. Her hands, though unsteady, knew the path well. Her fingers hovered over the handle. Not yet, she thought. But soon. The world might still see her as small and shrinking, but for the first time in a long time, Ruth felt tall. She felt dangerous. And that was the moment it began, not with fireworks or grand declarations, but with the quiet decision to believe in something again. Not in science. Not even in Elon Musk. But in herself. Ruth Harper sat at the kitchen table with the blue mug between her palms like it might anchor her to something solid, her gaze fixed on the edge of the table where the finish had chipped away into a crescent scar from when Tom accidentally dropped the pepper grinder during one of their Sunday night dinners, and the memory of that laughter felt so far away it was like remembering another lifetime. Another person who looked like her but still carried light in her voice, and now the house was so quiet it made her own breathing feel intrusive, and somewhere beyond the silence her mind was replaying Elon Musk's voice again like a looped recording. Stop accepting that being older means being obsolete, and that single sentence had unraveled something in her that she had kept bound for years, something raw and restless and unwilling to go back to sleep. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that age was not the ending of the story but just a transition in tone, a shift in genre, the part where the hero returns changed, still bruised but bolder, and yet a louder voice inside her kept whispering that it was all nonsense, that technology was for the young, that reinvention was a word for people with time to waste, and that maybe the reason her life had become so small was because smallness was all that was left. That morning she had driven to the pharmacy and parked in her usual spot, watching people come and go through the windshield with the kind of detachment that made her feel like she was on the outside of life looking in, her body stiff from sitting too long, her fingers curled on the steering wheel, and her mind drifting into the familiar fog of memory, but something had shifted this time. Because instead of remembering the past with the usual numbness she felt a sharp ache, a sudden grief not just for what she had lost but for what she had abandoned. At the pharmacy counter, the teenage clerk with too much eyeliner and a nose ring had asked her to verify her date of birth, and when Ruth answered, the girl had blinked like the number was a punchline, and said, "Wow, you don't look that old," and the word old lingered in the air like a fly in a room with no exits, buzzing against her skull long after she'd left the store, and she couldn't decide whether the comment had been meant as kindness or pity or just the kind of thing people said to fill the silence, but either way it reminded her of what everyone saw when they looked at her, gray hair, slower steps, someone meant to move aside. That afternoon Carrie called, her voice always clipped with a tired brightness, like she was smiling through clenched teeth, and they went through the usual script, "How are you, how are the boys, what did you make for dinner?" And just before they hung up Ruth mentioned the news she'd seen, the Musk announcement, trying to keep her voice light but steady, and there was a pause so thick it felt like a wall, and then Carrie laughed, a short little snort of disbelief, and said, "You're not actually thinking about that stuff, are you?" Ruth said maybe she was, and Carrie's tone shifted to the kind of slow caution people use when talking to someone they think is on the verge of doing something foolish, and she said, "Mom, seriously, you need to slow down, okay? That stuff's not for people like you. It's not safe. It's experimental. You know how they prey on older people with this futuristic junk. I saw a whole article on it." Ruth had gone quiet, nodding even though Carrie couldn't see her, and after they said goodbye she'd sat there staring at the wall, the phrase "people like you" echoing louder than anything else, and the words felt like a label slapped across her chest in permanent marker, sealing her off from the world of possibilities, and she hated how easily she had accepted it, how quickly her resolve had crumbled just because her daughter sounded disappointed. That night, the news was filled with backlash, governments across Europe calling for regulation, politicians warning of inequality, talking heads debating the ethics of cognitive enhancement for the elderly, and every opinion piece sounded the same, fear wrapped in sophistication, concern disguised as control, and underneath it all, Ruth heard the same unspoken truth: they didn't want older people to have access to change, because the system worked better when people like her stayed quiet, stayed still, stayed out of the way. And yet, buried among the noise, she found a clip of a podcast where Elon was being interviewed, sitting casually in a chair, his voice calm but firm, and when asked about the controversy he said, "We don't fear old age, we fear irrelevance. If we can fix that, maybe we fix something deeper. I'm not saying everyone should do this. I'm saying no one should be denied the chance." Ruth rewound it 3 times, each time feeling the words press deeper into her skin, not because they were profound but because they named the thing she had never been brave enough to say aloud. She didn't fear dying, not really, but she feared being forgotten while still alive. She feared the feeling that every new day was just a rerun of the last, that her story had quietly been filed under the end, without her consent. The next morning, she stood in the bathroom staring at her reflection, noting the lines around her mouth, the tired slope of her eyes, the soft sag of skin at her jawline, and she thought of how many times she had avoided looking too long, as if her own face were a stranger who might judge her, and then she whispered to herself, "What if it's not too late?" And the sound of it startled her, like hearing a voice in an empty house. She didn't know what she meant by it exactly, but it felt like a crack in the wall, a hairline fracture in the prison of habit and hesitation, and later that day she found herself scrolling through a website that was accepting beta applicants for NeuroLeaper, just a name and email required, no payment, just interest, and she hesitated, finger hovering above the screen, heart thumping in her ears like a drumbeat from some lost tribe of her own youth, and then she tapped submit and felt something inside her exhale. That night she didn't sleep well. Her mind was a storm of arguments between old ghosts and new dreams, voices of caution and courage colliding like thunder in her chest, and she kept seeing flashes of moments she had tried to forget. Carrie at 16, screaming, "You never believe in me," before slamming the door, the day she turned down a chance to speak at a writer's workshop because she wasn't ready, the time Tom asked her, gently, if she'd ever go back to her novel, and she laughed like it was a joke because it was easier than admitting she was afraid. But now fear didn't feel like enough of a reason anymore. Fear had become boring, predictable. And maybe, just maybe, she was ready to be unpredictable again. The sun rose without fanfare. She made coffee and stood at the window, watching a squirrel navigate the bird feeder with reckless brilliance, leaping from branch to railing like gravity was just a suggestion, and she felt a strange kinship with the little thing, unsure, uninvited, but unwilling to give up. A letter arrived that afternoon confirming her inclusion in a trial interest group. It wasn't a guarantee of anything, just a link to schedule a call and learn more. Still, she held it like it was a golden ticket. Her fingers trembled again, but this time it wasn't from weakness. It was from something else. Something that felt suspiciously like anticipation. There would be more doubt. More voices. She knew that. But in this moment, alone in a quiet house with a crumpled paper in one hand and a future she hadn't believed in pressing softly at the edges of her mind, Ruth Harper felt the war inside her pause, not because it had been won, but because for the first time, she'd chosen to fight back. The wind pushed against Ruth Harper's coat as she stepped outside, the sky above her a thin silver wash of late November, the air crisp and sharp with that particular edge it only gets before the first real snow, and she hugged her arms around her chest, not just against the cold but against the sudden hollowness in her body that she couldn't quite explain, like something had been knocked loose overnight and was now rattling inside her with every step she took toward the grocery store, the sidewalk uneven beneath her shoes and her breath coming shorter than usual, and she told herself it was nothing, that she just needed to walk more, get some blood flowing, keep moving. But as she crossed the quiet intersection and passed the bakery where she used to buy raspberry tarts for Tom, a wave of dizziness rolled over her like a slow, suffocating tide, and the next thing she knew her knees were buckling, the world tilting, the pavement rising fast, and then nothing. She didn't remember the fall, just the impact, the sound of her own voice in her ears yelling out a name that didn't belong to anyone nearby, and then a woman's face hovering over her, eyes wide with worry, her mouth moving fast like a foreign film dubbed wrong, and someone was calling for help, and then she was in the ambulance with lights bouncing off the ceiling, the siren not nearly as loud as the question screaming through her own mind. Had she made a mistake? Was her body already too far gone? Had she been foolish to think change was possible? Was this what Carrie had warned her about? At the hospital, they said it was a drop in blood pressure combined with dehydration and stress, a warning sign, nothing life-threatening, but still serious, and the doctor, young, kind, professional, looked at her with that same soft tone she had come to resent, the tone people reserved for the elderly, a mixture of sympathy and distance, like she was a porcelain figurine someone had found in a dusty attic and didn't quite know what to do with. He told her to rest, to avoid sudden activity, to be careful, and when she mentioned the NeuroLeaper trial, his eyes narrowed just slightly, and he said, "You really ought to be cautious with things like that, Mrs. Harper. There's a lot we still don't know. Let the younger generations test it first." And then he smiled, like it was a joke, like it was reasonable, but Ruth felt her stomach twist, not at the words, but at the ease with which people decided for her what she should and shouldn't dare. Back home, she moved slower. Everything took more effort. Her energy was low, her thoughts foggier than before, and that tiny flicker of hope that had begun to light in her chest felt dangerously close to snuffing out, like a match in the rain. She spent 2 days doing nothing but sitting in her recliner, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the muted television and replaying the moment she fell, the way the ground felt too hard, too final, the way the nurse had looked at her like she was fragile, and she began to wonder if maybe they were right, maybe it really was too late, maybe she should just focus on being comfortable, on not falling again, on not trying so hard to rewrite a story that everyone else seemed to have already shelved. But on the third morning, something shifted. She woke up before dawn, her head unusually clear, and she reached for her tablet out of habit, the screen casting a faint glow in the darkness as she scrolled through the headlines, and there, buried among the usual chaos, was a link to a TEDx video titled "Neuroplasticity and the Myth of Too Late," and though it wasn't from Elon himself, the speaker quoted him within the first 60 seconds, "People say time is a river, but it's more like a choice. You can't swim upstream, but you can build a new boat." The woman on stage was in her 70s, vibrant, sharp, talking about how she'd relearned a language after age 65, how she'd taken up photography, how the brain didn't care about age nearly as much as people did, and Ruth watched, leaning forward slowly, her heart beating a little faster, the fog in her chest lifting just enough for a beam of sunlight to cut through, and when the video ended she sat still, her breath shallow, not because she was afraid anymore, but because she felt something she hadn't in weeks, a pull forward. She opened the email link the Neuroleaper team had sent and reread the invitation to schedule her intake call. Her finger hovered over the button. Her mind still rattled with doubt. But then she remembered the fall, and instead of fear, she felt anger. Anger that she had taken it as a sign to stop instead of a sign to begin, that she had accepted the voices telling her to slow down without asking why they wanted her to in the first place. She clicked the link. Scheduled the call. Wrote it on her calendar in permanent marker, the thick black line slicing across the blank space like a declaration. The call was scheduled for Friday at 11 a.m. When the day came, she wore the green sweater Tom had loved, the one with the tiny embroidered pine tree on the shoulder, and she brushed her hair, applied a little lipstick, and cleared the kitchen table like she was expecting company, her tablet propped up on a makeshift stand, and when the screen lit up and the face of a young woman appeared, smart, efficient, surprisingly kind, Ruth was ready. They asked questions. Medical history, cognitive health, emotional well-being. They talked about the potential risks, the side effects, the uncertainty. Ruth listened, asked questions of her own, took notes. At the end of the call, the woman smiled and said, "We'll be selecting a small group for the first round of remote interface trials. You've qualified for consideration. Someone will reach out within 2 weeks." Ruth thanked her, ended the call, and sat in silence, the sound of the refrigerator humming in the background like applause. She didn't tell Carrie. Not yet. She wasn't ready for the conversation. She knew it would come with the same mix of concern and disapproval, the same gentle scolding wrapped in love, and she didn't want that voice in her head right now. She wanted her own. The next day, she walked down the street again, just to prove to herself she could, her steps cautious but sure, the wind biting at her cheeks, and something about the cold felt exhilarating, like a dare she was finally accepting. At the corner, she passed a group of teenagers huddled around a phone, laughing, and one of them glanced up, eyes locking with hers for just a second, and Ruth didn't look away. She nodded. He nodded back. Small, meaningless maybe, but to her it felt like the world recognizing her presence, not as an obstacle but as a participant. When she got home, she opened the drawer with the manuscript. Her fingers brushed the folder, hesitated, then pulled it out. She unfolded the first page. The title was smudged, faded. The ink had bled slightly from age. But the words were still there. Her words. She read them aloud, her voice trembling but firm, and when she finished the first page she flipped to the second, and then the third. When she finally looked up, the sun had moved halfway across the room. She hadn't noticed. She hadn't felt the ache in her legs or the strain in her back. She had been somewhere else. Somewhere alive. That night, before bed, she wrote one new sentence. Just one. But it was enough. The crisis had come. The fall had hurt. The warning signs had screamed. But Ruth Harper had chosen not to retreat. She had chosen to move forward anyway. It wasn't courage exactly. It wasn't certainty. But it was something close. And for now, that was everything. Ruth Harper woke up before the sun, her eyes opening to the soft darkness of her bedroom where the familiar shapes of dresser, curtain, and bedside lamp formed a quiet silhouette of the life she'd lived for decades, but something was different today, not outside but within her, a tension under her ribs that felt more like anticipation than dread, the way she used to feel the morning before the library's big annual reading event or before a parent-teacher meeting where she'd been asked to speak about children's literacy. And she realized as she lay there listening to the rhythmic tick of the wall clock that she hadn't felt this way in years, like something was about to happen that mattered. She got up slowly, careful with her footing, the memory of the fall still etched into her muscles, but this time there was no hesitation in her steps, no second-guessing whether she should try, she simply moved. The kitchen was quiet and cold, the floor cool beneath her slippers, and as she waited for the coffee to brew, she pulled the manuscript back from the table where she'd left it the night before, flipping through the pages like she was meeting someone again after a long time apart, her own handwriting staring back at her, faded but fierce, and she realized with a strange clarity that this wasn't just a story. It was a version of herself she'd tried to bury under years of practicality and self-doubt, a voice she thought she'd outgrown but had never truly silenced. After coffee, she sat with her tablet and opened the email app, checking for a reply from the Neuraleaper team even though she knew it was still too early for any official notice, and then without fully thinking it through she opened a new message window and typed a short note to herself, addressed, to my future self, and it read, "If you're reading this, you chose not to disappear. You chose the wild, absurd idea that your life still matters. Keep going." She hit save and smiled, then stood up, grabbed her coat, and went out the door without telling anyone. She didn't go far, just 2 blocks to the old hardware store that had a dusty corner filled with notepads, pens, and small office supplies that hadn't changed in 20 years, and she bought herself a new notebook, the kind with thick ruled pages and a spiral binding, and a blue pen that fit comfortably in her fingers, and when the cashier rang it up without even looking at her, Ruth didn't feel invisible. She felt undercover, like a secret agent on a mission no one else could see. When she got home, she opened the notebook to the first page, wrote the date in the top corner, and started rewriting the first scene of her novel, not editing, not polishing, just writing from memory and feeling, letting the words tumble out unfiltered, and for the first time in decades, she didn't stop herself after the first awkward sentence. She didn't think about publishing or audience or outcome. She just wrote. It felt like a rebellion. That afternoon she sat on the back porch with a blanket wrapped around her legs and watched the wind play with the dry leaves in the yard, the sky low and gray with the promise of snow, and for once she didn't feel trapped by the weather or the season of her life, she felt in step with it, like she too was shedding something, like the quiet dying of things was part of the cycle that made space for something new. A robin landed on the edge of the birdbath, its feathers puffed against the cold, and she thought of Tom, how he used to scatter seed just before dusk and whistle softly while watching the sparrows fight over crumbs. And instead of feeling the usual pang of grief, she felt something warmer, like maybe he would have loved this version of her too, the one who wasn't waiting anymore, the one who was starting again. That evening she opened YouTube and typed in Elon Musk's name, not to hear about rockets or Teslas but because she wanted to understand what was behind that strange, quiet certainty he carried in his voice, that sense of challenge wrapped in calm, and she landed on an old clip from years ago, an interview where he was asked what kept him going when everyone thought he would fail, and he said something she'd never heard before. Some people build escape plans. I build what I want to run toward. Ruth paused the video, her finger hovering above the screen, and whispered, "What am I running toward?" The question startled her because she didn't have an answer yet, but she liked the way it made her feel, open, curious, restless in a good way. Over the next few days she developed a routine. Morning writing with coffee. A midday walk even if it was cold. A small journal entry in the afternoon about what she'd seen or felt or remembered. She didn't share any of this with Carrie, who called once during the week to ask if Ruth needed anything and to talk about her youngest son's math troubles, and Ruth listened and nodded and offered suggestions, but she didn't mention the notebook or the writing or the Neuroleaper trial, not out of secrecy but because it was still hers, still sacred, and she wasn't ready to let anyone else touch it yet. Then the call came. A man from the Neuroleaper team, voice professional but kind, told her she'd been selected for remote onboarding as part of the Phase 1 Independent Cognitive Interface Test Group. It sounded like science fiction. But it felt like destiny. They explained how the device would arrive by courier within 7 days, how setup was simple, how all she had to do was wear it for 20 minutes a day and complete a few guided exercises using the app interface. "You're not signing away your future," the man assured her. "You're just giving yourself a new tool for it." She thanked him, heart pounding in her ears, and after the call she sat in the quiet and stared at the kitchen wall, trying to let it sink in, trying not to be scared, trying not to wonder what Carrie would say or what the neighbors would think or what if it didn't work. But then she opened her notebook again, turned to the next blank page, and wrote the first words of Chapter 2 of her novel, and just like that she remembered what Elon had said about building what you run toward, and this was it. When the package arrived, it came in a sleek white box, minimalist and modern, with her name printed in small gray font on a card inside the lid. The device itself was lighter than she expected, almost delicate, a simple band with smooth metal contacts and a small charging dock. She held it like a sacred object, nervous but ready, and followed the instructions on the Quick Start card: download the app, register her device, begin calibration. She expected the app to be complicated, but it wasn't. It guided her like a gentle teacher through each step: place the band, relax your breath, focus on the image, let your thoughts drift. The first session was only 10 minutes. A soft light pattern played across the screen, accompanied by tones that reminded her of wind chimes and rainfall, and she felt her mind open in strange directions, not dizzy or disoriented but more like the feeling you get just before sleep when memories blur with dreams. When it ended, she opened her eyes and felt alert. Not younger, not faster, just more present, like someone had cleaned a window she'd been looking through for years without realizing how dirty it had become. Over the next week she kept going. Daily sessions. Writing. Walking. Noticing more. Smelling the soap more deeply. Tasting food with sharper awareness. Remembering details of her childhood she hadn't thought about in decades: her father's laugh, the color of the bike she rode when she was 9, the texture of the pink gloves her mother gave her for Christmas in 1961. It didn't feel magical. It felt honest. Like herself, returned. One evening, as snow finally began to fall outside, Ruth sat at her desk and looked at the growing pile of written pages beside her. Real words. Real chapters. Real effort. And she said aloud, with a quiet strength she hadn't known she still had, "This is the one thing I changed." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't broadcast. But it was everything. The device hadn't saved her. Elon Musk hadn't swooped in. What had changed was that she said yes to something. That she chose not to die before she was dead. That she took the first step and let it carry her into the next. The choice had been hers. And for the first time in a long, long time, she felt proud of that. The wind had changed by the time Ruth Harper opened her front door that morning, and she felt it immediately, the shift in the air, like something was being carried toward her, something unseen but deeply felt, the kind of feeling she used to get before her husband Tom walked through the door with good news he couldn't wait to share, or before the phone rang with a call she hadn't expected but somehow knew was coming. And though she told herself not to overthink it, not to get swept up in signs and symbols, a part of her knew that something had turned, that the tide inside her was no longer receding but rising. She had just finished her daily NeuroLeaper session, and for the first time, the memory it brought back wasn't one of sorrow or regret but something joyful. Her daughter Carrie at age 7, barefoot in the backyard, arms outstretched as she spun in circles with dandelions in her hair, shouting, "Look, Mama, I'm the earth," and Ruth had watched her then with a heart so full it ached, and now, decades later, that same ache bloomed again, not in grief but in awe, in wonder that her mind still carried such beauty and could bring it back like it had just happened. She sat down with her notebook, her hands trembling not from age or fear but from the sheer weight of what she was about to do, because today she was going to write the ending of the novel, not polish or revise or perfect, just finish the story she had started so long ago in a time when she still believed stories like hers mattered. She had rewritten the beginning, found her rhythm in the middle, and now the end was calling her, not as a conclusion but as a kind of rebirth. The pen moved faster than she expected, like it had been waiting for permission, and the words spilled out like a river long held back by ice, and though she cried as she wrote, tears falling without shame, without explanation, she didn't stop, didn't flinch, didn't second-guess, and when the final sentence came, she wrote it without hesitation, and just like that, she realized the cage had never been locked. She stared at it, those 12 words, simple and small but bigger than anything she had written in years, and she laughed, an involuntary burst of sound that startled even her, the kind of laugh that comes when a weight is lifted from your chest and you remember what breath is supposed to feel like. That afternoon she emailed the manuscript to herself, saving it in a folder titled Second Life, and then, without planning to, she posted a message to an online writing forum she hadn't visited in years, just a short note that said, "I'm 72, and I just finished the novel I abandoned at 42. I thought it was too late. It wasn't. If you're out there and you're wondering if your story still matters, write it. You're not done." She didn't expect a response. She wasn't looking for praise. But within an hour, replies started pouring in, people from all over, some her age, some younger, all saying thank you, all saying they were inspired, and one message in particular caught her breath: "You just gave me permission. I've had a story locked away for decades. I'm opening the drawer tonight." That night she couldn't sleep, but not from restlessness or worry, she was lit from within, a kind of quiet fire burning in her chest, and she got out of bed, put on her robe, and walked into the living room where the snow outside reflected off the windows like soft light from another world, and she stood there barefoot on the wooden floor, breathing deeply, her heart open to something she couldn't name. Her tablet buzzed. A notification from the NeuroLeaper app: new phase available, neural expression feedback. Optional. Requires written input. She clicked without hesitation. The screen asked her to submit a piece of writing. Anything. A paragraph. A page. Something original. She copied the last 2 pages of her novel into the app and hit send. The message on screen read, "Thank you. Feedback in 24 hours. The next day was slow. Snow continued to fall. The street was quiet. She walked in place for 20 minutes just to move her legs. Ate soup. Looked out the window. Waited. At exactly 3:18 p.m., the tablet buzzed again. Feedback available. She opened the app. There was a message: "Ruth, your submission has been flagged for exceptional emotional recall and language coherence, placing you in the 98th percentile among all Phase 1 participants. Would you be open to sharing your story with the broader NeuroLeaper community?" She stared at the screen, unable to breathe. Not because she needed recognition. Not because she wanted attention. But because for the first time in so long, someone had looked at something she made and said, "This has value." She clicked yes. A simple response. And that was it. Or so she thought. The next morning she woke up to an inbox full of emails. Dozens. Then hundreds. The Neuroleaper community had featured her story in their internal newsletter, and somehow it had been picked up by a tech blog, and then reposted on social media, and then someone tagged Elon Musk. She didn't understand how all of it worked, hashtags, reposts, viral loops, but she didn't need to. What mattered was the messages. One from a 68-year-old man in Oregon who said he'd stopped painting 10 years ago after his wife died but was now setting up his easel again. One from a retired professor in Maine who said she'd lost her voice after a stroke but was now dictating poems to her granddaughter. One from a woman in Kansas who simply wrote, "You made me feel seen." And then, 2 days later, Carrie called. Her voice was sharp with emotion, not anger, not confusion, but something softer, deeper, like the sound a dam makes just before it breaks. "Mom," she said, "why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell me you were doing this? Your story is all over my feed. You're on a podcast. People are quoting you." Ruth didn't know what to say. For a moment, silence stretched between them, and then she said, "Because I didn't want anyone to talk me out of it before I found out what I still had." Carrie was quiet. Then she whispered, "I'm proud of you." The words hit like sunlight after a storm. They weren't dramatic. They weren't loud. But they healed something. Repaired a fracture neither of them had known how to name. They talked for nearly an hour. About the story. The writing. The device. The fear. The joy. And at the end, Carrie said, "When you come visit next month, I want you to read it to the boys. They should know who their grandmother really is." Ruth nodded, even though Carrie couldn't see her, tears tracing soft lines down her cheeks. She hung up and sat still, hands folded in her lap, and whispered, "Thank you, not to anyone in particular, maybe to Elon, maybe to herself, maybe to whatever strange alignment of science and soul had brought her to this moment." She didn't know what would come next. Whether the story would be published. Whether she'd keep getting messages. Whether the attention would fade. But none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was that the story existed. That she had finished it. That people had read it and felt something stir in themselves. That she had reached through the fog of irrelevance and found not just visibility but connection. That night, as she lay in bed with the snow still falling outside, Ruth Harper smiled in the dark and whispered, "This is what breaking through feels like." And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of what came next. She was ready. Ruth Harper no longer saw the world the way she used to, and it wasn't because her vision had improved or because the snow-covered streets of her neighborhood had changed in any way. Everything was still familiar, still quiet, still dotted with porches wrapped in holiday lights and driveways blanketed in untouched powder. But the way her mind processed it, the way her spirit received it, had altered so deeply that even the silence of a frozen morning now felt like a song being sung just for her, as though every glint of sunlight bouncing off the ice was a message and every crunch of her boots against the sidewalk was a sign she was still here, still part of the unfolding story. She walked with more intention now, not faster or stronger, but with a kind of presence she hadn't known was possible at her age, her gaze not downcast but lifted, and when she passed neighbors she barely knew, she found herself smiling first, not because she felt obligated but because something inside her had bloomed and wanted to be shared. One morning, as she passed by a small park on the edge of town, she noticed a boy sitting alone on a swing, no phone in sight, just staring at the ground, his feet scuffing slow lines in the dirt beneath him, and something about the way he sat reminded her of her grandson Caleb when he was small and couldn't find the words for what hurt, so she stopped, just for a second, and said softly, "You okay, hon?" The boy looked up, startled, and then nodded without speaking, but the way his shoulders shifted, the way his eyes met hers, made her wonder if maybe just being noticed had helped. She continued walking, heart strangely full, and thought about all the times she'd walked through life invisible, dismissed, assumed to be finished, and how that one moment, that quiet recognition, had once been all she needed too. Back home she opened her notebook and began writing a new scene, one not from the original novel but something fresh, something born from the now. A short story about a boy in a park and an old woman who sees him, not because she's wise or magical, but because she remembers. Her writing was different now. Not technically better, she still struggled with pacing, still second-guessed every adjective, but emotionally sharper, more immediate, like the walls in her brain had fallen away and she was finally speaking in her true voice. The Neuraleaper device, she was beginning to realize, wasn't about becoming someone else, it was about returning to the clearest version of herself, the self buried under decades of routine, pain, and the dulling effect of being told, over and over again, that her best years were behind her. That lie had sat in her bones for so long it had calcified, and now, day by day, it was being chiseled out, replaced by a vibrant defiance that startled her even in quiet moments. That afternoon she received another message from the Neuraleaper team. Not from an assistant or a tech rep, but from someone with a title she didn't quite understand, Strategic Vision Liaison. The woman introduced herself as Nadira, said she'd been following Ruth's progress since the writing submission and had a proposal she wanted to discuss. Ruth agreed to the video call, half expecting it to be a formality, maybe a polite invitation to participate in a survey or testimonial. But when Nadira's face appeared on the screen, sharp eyes, silver-streaked hair, the kind of calm confidence Ruth associated with astronauts or orchestra conductors, everything shifted. Nadira got straight to the point. Neuraleaper was preparing a public showcase, a global event that would unveil the full scope of their technology's potential, not just as a cognitive enhancement tool but as a means to bridge generations, to empower marginalized minds, to redefine what aging meant, and they wanted Ruth to be part of it. Ruth blinked. Me? Why me? Nadira smiled. Because you're exactly who we built this for, even if we didn't know it at first. You're not just a user, you're the outcome. The word struck her with such force that she felt tears prick the corners of her eyes. She wasn't a case study. She wasn't a before and after. She was proof. Nadira continued, explaining that Ruth wouldn't be alone. There were others, people from Brazil, Germany, Japan, South Africa, all over the world, who had experienced breakthroughs of their own through the trial, and they were all going to be featured in what Elon himself had described as a transmission from the future to the present. Ruth laughed at that. Sounds dramatic. Nadira grinned. He has a flair for the cinematic. But he's not wrong. The showcase would be virtual, broadcast live, with segments pre-recorded and others interactive. Ruth's role was simple: tell her story. In her words. No script. Just truth. They'd send a production team to film her at home. She could say no. But Ruth didn't hesitate. Yes, she said. I'll do it. After the call, she sat for a long time in silence, letting it all wash over her, the weight of it, the surrealness, the strange and wonderful realization that her life had taken a turn she would have never believed possible just a few weeks ago. She whispered Tom's name into the quiet and imagined him chuckling in that low, warm way he used to, telling her she'd always been remarkable, she'd just forgotten. The film crew arrived 3 days later. 2 kind young people in their 20s, respectful and curious, who treated her like someone important, not in a performative way, but with genuine attention, asking about the writing, the device, the fall, the memory of the dandelion, and when they set up the camera in her living room and asked her to speak directly to it, she took a deep breath and said, "My name is Ruth Harper," and I almost faded without anyone noticing. But I didn't. And here's why. Her story poured out like water from a pitcher finally tipped. She told them about the loss, the fear, the resistance, and then the shift, the quote from Elon, the writing, the decision to not disappear quietly. And at the end, her voice cracked as she said, "I thought I needed permission to matter again. But it turns out I just needed to stop waiting for it." The young woman behind the camera wiped a tear from her cheek. "You just made me think about my grandmother. I wish she'd had something like this." Ruth smiled softly. Maybe she still does. Maybe this is for her too. After they left, the house felt quiet but not empty. Charged. As if the walls themselves had absorbed the energy of what had just happened. Ruth opened her tablet, wrote a quick blog post titled, "What Happens When You Stop Waiting," and posted it to the Neuraleaper community. Within minutes, comments flooded in. People were not only inspired, they were moved to action. One man said he had signed up for piano lessons. A woman in her 60s shared a photo of her first oil painting. A retired firefighter said he was building a telescope in his garage. Ruth realized something then: this wasn't just about her story. It was about creating space for others to believe in theirs. That night, she didn't dream about the past for the first time in years. She dreamed about a stage filled with people her age holding up books, paintings, letters, devices, seeds, things they had made, reclaimed, begun. And in the center, a simple quote in lights. "What if everything you believed about getting old was wrong?" When she woke up, she whispered the words aloud and smiled. It was already happening. The world was watching. And this time, Ruth Harper wasn't going to look away. It started with a countdown, not the dramatic kind with sirens and flashing lights, but a soft digital pulse, numbers glowing quietly in the corner of Ruth Harper's screen, ticking down the final seconds before the live broadcast began, and she could hardly believe that in a matter of moments, her story, the quiet, often invisible life of a retired librarian from a small Midwestern town, was about to be shared with millions of people around the world, and for a flicker of a second, the weight of it almost made her close the laptop, almost made her retreat to the familiar safety of silence, but then she remembered that cold afternoon when she had stood barefoot at her window and whispered, "This is what breaking through feels like," and she knew, with every bone and wrinkle and memory in her, that this wasn't a moment to hide from, this was the moment her entire second life had been preparing her for. The screen went dark for a beat, then lit up with the Neuraleaper insignia, silver waves curling outward like thought ripples, and beneath it, in clean white font, "The Next Mind, Global Showcase of Possibility," and suddenly, music began, not loud or boastful, but ethereal, a blend of piano and wind and something that felt like time itself stretching open. Then the screen shifted to a live image of a large, high-ceilinged studio filled with people of all ages seated around glowing tables shaped like neurons, and in the center stood Nadira, dressed in a deep navy suit, her silver-streaked hair pulled back, her voice calm and commanding as she began to speak. "Today we are not unveiling a product. We are unveiling a proof. A proof that the limits we've accepted around aging, memory, and relevance were never real. They were designed. Inherited. And now, overwritten." The audience didn't cheer. They listened. They leaned in. And then Nadira said the words Ruth hadn't expected to hear, "Tonight, I want to introduce you to a woman who didn't plan on changing the world. She just decided not to disappear. Her name is Ruth Harper. And she reminds us what happens when the human mind, at any age, is given back to itself." The screen transitioned to Ruth's pre-recorded segment, and for a moment, she watched herself on screen as if watching a stranger, an older woman with a kind face, seated beside a snow-dusted window, hands folded, eyes steady, and then she heard her own voice begin, "My name is Ruth Harper. I'm 72 years old. And not long ago, I believed my life had already peaked." She had recorded that line more than a dozen times, trying to get it right, but now, played back against the backdrop of a global audience, it didn't feel rehearsed, it felt raw, earned, true. She watched herself speak about Tom, about Carrie, about the fall, about the dust-covered manuscript she hadn't dared to finish. She watched her own face crumple when she talked about being invisible in a grocery store aisle. And then she saw her own eyes shine as she described the moment she found Elon's quote about building things to run toward, and how it had been like a match struck in the dark. The montage shifted to clips of her writing, walking, sitting in her porch swing with a notebook on her lap. And then came the words that hadn't been scripted, that had come out spontaneously during filming, but that now felt like the heartbeat of everything. "We don't stop dreaming because we grow old. We grow old because we stop dreaming. I almost let myself vanish." And this story, is how I came back." The screen faded to black. The studio audience rose to its feet in silence, a kind of reverent stillness that said more than clapping ever could, and then the applause came, not explosive but steady, rising like a wave, not for her exactly but for what she represented, for everyone who had once felt their story had no more chapters. Ruth sat on her couch, eyes wide, hands clenched, heart thudding in her chest as the live stream continued, showcasing other Neuroleaper stories from around the world, a widowed violinist in Italy who had composed her first symphony, a retired engineer in Seoul who had reconstructed lost blueprints of a bridge he once designed, a teacher in Brazil who had used the device to restore her fluency in 3 languages after a brain injury. One after another, these lives unfolded on the screen, not as miracles but as reclaimings, and with each one, Ruth felt less like an exception and more like part of a tide. Then, in the final segment of the program, the camera returned to the studio, and there, standing beside Nadira, was a figure Ruth recognized instantly, not from the countless videos or interviews she'd watched, but from something deeper, a kind of mythic familiarity that made her sit up straighter: Elon Musk. He looked the same as always. Unruly hair, thoughtful eyes, half-smile that could pass for amusement or mischief, but his presence shifted the air in the room, even through a screen. He didn't speak right away. Just looked around the room, then into the camera, and said, "There's a lot of talk about what we can build for the future. Mars. Machines. Artificial minds. But I think the most powerful thing we can build is a reason for people to believe they're not done yet." He gestured toward a display showing a gallery of faces, Ruth's included, beneath the words, "Cognitive Awakening." He continued, "The governments of the world will watch tonight. Some of them will panic. Because for a long time, the system has depended on people giving up. Getting out of the way. Retiring from relevance. But that was always a design flaw. The human mind, especially one seasoned by decades of living, has more value than we've allowed it to show." Then he looked directly into the lens and said, "If you're watching this and you're over 60, I want you to hear me, you are not past tense. You are not obsolete. You are the most underutilized technology on this planet. And it's time we upgraded that thinking." Ruth felt her breath catch. She hadn't expected to be addressed so directly, so deliberately. But now it felt as if the entire broadcast had been aimed at the millions like her who had believed, quietly, heartbreakingly, that their part in the story had ended. The broadcast ended with a simple screen: "The next chapter starts now." No branding. No logo. Just those 6 words. Ruth sat back, hands still trembling, overwhelmed not just by the experience but by what it meant, for her, for people like her, for the world that might now begin to see elders not as burdens but as reservoirs of untapped power, waiting only for someone, or something, to believe in their ignition. Her tablet pinged. A message from Carrie. Just 4 words. "I'm crying. Thank you." Then a second, "When can we talk?" Ruth replied immediately, "Now." They talked for nearly 2 hours. Carrie asked questions. Ruth answered honestly. They laughed, cried, and somewhere in the middle of it, Carrie said, "You know what's weird? I think you're the bravest person I know." Ruth smiled. "No, I'm just the most stubborn." And Carrie said, "Maybe those are the same thing." After the call, Ruth stood at her window and looked out into the dark, snowy street. Lights twinkled on porches. A dog barked in the distance. Somewhere in the house, the heater clicked on. She whispered to herself, "So this is what being seen feels like." She didn't know what would come next. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. But for the first time since she'd packed up her classroom, said goodbye to her students, and quietly let the world tell her she was finished, she felt herself standing at the very beginning of something. Something wild. Something new. Something beautifully unfinished. The world Ruth Harper had woken up to no longer felt safe, not because her writing had attracted enemies, but because the very idea of her being seen, of others like her being visible, had triggered something that felt both alarming and strangely affirming. The day after the global showcase, the news broke: governments, in the United States and abroad, were in a frenzy. They weren't reacting to her novel, her words, her story, they were reacting to what she represented, the radical possibility that age didn't have to be written off. She watched the coverage on her tablet while wrapped in her favorite blanket, snow drifting outside her window like ghosts of winters before, and saw headlines about regulatory crackdowns, ethical panic, murmurs of control, of containment, as if someone seeing their own worth was now a liability to be managed. In Washington, public interest groups and watchdogs, ones that had long been skeptical of Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, renewed their warnings that allowing elder minds to have this power was dangerous. Musk had embedded AI systems in agency workflows, pushing through layoffs and policy changes in just 100 days, destroying USD agency structures while re-engineering access to personal and bureaucratic data, all under the guise of efficiency. Opposition groups had tracked promises of trillions in waste savings down to a mere fraction, leaving questions about long-term damage to public services. The fear wasn't just about innovation. It was about who got to change, and who was written off. Ruth felt a knot tighten in her belly as she realized that celebrating her dawn, her second beginning, was being conflated with threatening the status quo. She didn't want fear to win. Not again. For the first time, she drafted a public letter on her blog: "I'm not here to test the limits of power. I'm here to remind us that limits are often illusions." She posted it, hands trembling not with fear but with intention. As the responses flowed in, some confused, some scared, some cheering, she sensed another undercurrent: people were wrestling with permission and power. It wasn't just about changing herself. It was about whether the system around her was brave enough to let that change thrive. In Europe, even more dramatic scenes were unfolding. Elon Musk's political entanglements across the Atlantic, his endorsements of AfD in Germany, Vox in Spain, his provocations of leaders, had angered many voters and alarmed democracies. Protests against Tesla stores had been raging for weeks, framed not as anti-vehicles but anti-influence. The Tesla takedown movement had become a force, showing how symbols can shift meaning, how one man's experiment could rouse global dissent. Watching this unfold, Ruth felt a flicker of guilt, not at being the symbol, but at how much larger the drama had become. She wasn't political. She was just someone who had stopped waiting. But sometimes stories grew bigger than their teller, and she realized she couldn't unsee what was unfolding. She could retreat. Or she could keep going. So she started planning. Quietly. She reached out to Nadira, the liaison who had invited her to the showcase. She asked if it was possible to join a panel, a civil conversation, not a spectacle, about the ethics of aging and innovation. She wasn't tech-savvy. She wasn't a policy expert. But she knew some things. What it felt like to be erased, what it took to be found again. Nadira wrote back quickly, affirming she'd find a place, but warned her that backlash was coming from politicians, regulators, and protest movements alike. Suddenly, being relevant felt frightening. Not because of the technology, but because relevance demanded accountability. Ruth spent long evenings staring at the wall clock, listening to the hum of her house, breathing in the possibility of new stories while the world around her trembled. And then her daughter Carrie visited. She came into the house with gloves still on, the door hanging open behind her. "Mom," she said, voice soft, worried, "they're saying you're part of a dangerous experiment. That you were manipulated. That this woke-up story is being used to manipulate people like you." Ruth nodded, tears stinging her eyes. "I know," she whispered. "But I'm not afraid of my story." Carrie leaned in and hugged her. "I just want you to be safe." That night, Ruth lay awake, turning her life over in her mind, the novel, the device, the shining moment in the studio, the backlash. She heard Musk's words replayed in her mind: "You are the most underutilized technology on this planet." She thought of the boy in the park, the dandelions in Carrie's hair, the snow outside. She thought of how many people had logged on to the live stream during the showcase. She thought about how much was built on fear, and how much more could be built on love. When dawn came, she drafted another post, this time for herself, not the world. If relevance is dangerous, let it be. But I choose it anyway. Because my mind, my voice, my story, they're not liabilities. They're legacies. She posted it. She let it rest. And then, unbelievably, the responses weren't bombs. They were flowers. She received messages from people in governments quietly sharing how her story gave them courage to push policies for elder education. From teachers whose workshops were being reclassified because students, older than they imagined, wanted to start new chapters. From a retired surgeon now learning digital art, saying, I didn't think I dared anymore. Not protests. Quiet plans. Mindful change. Ruth realized that governments panicking wasn't just about her. It was about fear of change. But change, she thought quietly, isn't a hurricane, they're raindrops, one after another, until things shift. She leaned over the desk and wrote one more line in her notebook. We are all unfinished. Some of us just take longer to wake up. Then she closed it and went to make tea. The clock ticked. The snow outside began to melt. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Ruth Harper had never imagined that reclaiming her mind would turn into a kind of rebellion. Not the loud, fire on the streets kind. This was quieter, more insistent, more patient, but just as powerful. The day after her public letter went viral, the subtle tremors she'd felt began to ripple into something tangible. Emails, calls, messages flooded in, from people she didn't know, from strangers with stories that felt like echoes of her own. An ex-Marine in Ohio who'd started learning robotics at 70, a retired schoolteacher in Georgia rekindling her passion for writing poetry, a widow in Oregon who built a community garden and was using Neuraleaper to organize volunteers. They wrote about rediscovering purpose, about feeling seen for the first time in years, about daring to hope again. Ruth read every message, their words folding around her heart like a warm quilt, each one a tiny spark lighting her way forward. But it wasn't just individuals. Community centers, libraries, and senior groups began requesting talks, webinars, and workshops. They wanted to know how to access this new frontier of aging with dignity and power. Ruth's story had ignited a movement, quiet but unstoppable. The old image of aging as decline was cracking. She became an unlikely symbol, not of youth, but of renewed life, of an inner revolution where age was the soil, not the barrier. Meanwhile, the government's panic didn't subside. The Department of Government Efficiency doubled down on surveillance and control measures aimed at Neuraleaper's use, citing national security and mental health risks. New regulations threatened to limit access, framing elder cognition enhancement as a potential, societal destabilizer. Ruth saw this unfold in headlines and policy documents. The media painted the scene like a war, innovation versus control, hope versus fear. But Ruth saw something else beneath the chaos. She saw a generation waking up and refusing to be invisible. She thought of Elon Musk's quiet defiance, how he'd challenged the impossible and reshaped entire industries. That spark in him, that refusal to accept the limits imposed by others, had been her guide. And now, she had to channel that defiance herself. So Ruth organized. Not a protest. Not a rally. Something subtler, a quiet rebellion. It was a campaign to remind people that the power of aging minds could not be legislated away or dismissed. She invited writers, artists, scientists, and elders across the country to share their stories on her blog and social media, to reclaim the narrative of aging not as a slow fade but as a steady bloom. The hashtag not done yet began to trend quietly but steadily. On her daily walks through the neighborhood, Ruth noticed more faces looking up, more nods of recognition from strangers who felt the same fire. Carrie, once skeptical, became her staunchest ally, managing social media and helping craft messages that were honest, hopeful, and unafraid. At night, Ruth often replayed Elon Musk's words in her mind, "You are the most underutilized technology on this planet." She knew she wasn't just talking about neural chips or biotech. She was talking about the value of lived experience, the wisdom that decades etched into every line and scar. And the world was beginning to listen. One afternoon, Ruth received a call that startled her. It was from a senior advisor at the White House, someone who had been watching the movement quietly, someone who believed change wasn't just possible but necessary. The advisor wanted Ruth to join a panel discussing elder innovation and national policy, a chance to influence decisions that had felt so far removed from her quiet life. Ruth hesitated. She was just a librarian. What did she know about policy? But then she remembered the line she had spoken in the studio, "We don't stop dreaming because we grow old. We grow old because we stop dreaming." If she could be a voice for millions, she had to try. Preparing for the panel, Ruth dug into research, learning about cognitive science, public health, and the history of aging in America. She read everything she could find about the fears and hopes tied to elder innovation. She talked to caregivers, doctors, activists, and people who felt left behind. On the day of the panel, she sat backstage, heart pounding but steady, thinking about every moment that had led her here, the falls, the doubts, the manuscript gathering dust, the boy with dandelions, Elon Musk's words. When it was her turn, Ruth stepped into the bright lights and looked out at the room filled with policymakers, scientists, journalists, and advocates. She took a deep breath and spoke, her voice clear and unshakable, "I'm here not because I'm an expert, but because I'm a witness. I've lived the silence, the invisibility, the feeling that the world has already written your last chapter. But I stand here today because I've learned something powerful: aging is not an end. It's a continuation. It's a chance to build, to dream, to connect in ways we never imagined. We are not liabilities. We are legacies." The room was silent, then moved by applause. Afterwards, Ruth mingled with panelists and attendees who thanked her for bringing heart and honesty to the conversation. The quiet rebellion was no longer just a hashtag. It was a movement gaining momentum inside the halls of power. Back at home, as she poured herself a cup of chamomile tea, Ruth reflected on the journey from fear to hope. She thought about the governments that had panicked and the people who had awakened. She thought about Elon Musk, not as a savior, but as a spark, a mirror showing what was possible when fear gave way to courage. And she realized something profound: change isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet ones, the ones who refuse to vanish, who turn the tide. Ruth smiled, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. "We're just getting started," she whispered to the night. Ruth Harper's story was no longer hers alone. What had started as a personal reclamation had become a tidal wave of quiet revolution across communities, classrooms, and living rooms all over the country. She watched the ripple effect unfold with a mix of awe and humility, knowing that each small action was a pebble tossed into a still pond, only the pond was vast, and the ripples could not be stopped. The very idea that people over 60, long dismissed as past their prime, could still invent, innovate, and inspire was sparking something powerful and unexpected. It was the birth of a new narrative about aging, one that embraced strength and possibility rather than decline and loss. Across the nation, local libraries were transformed into hubs of elder creativity. In Pittsburgh, a group of retirees began coding together, inspired by Ruth's blog and Elon Musk's vision of limitless potential. In rural Montana, a former nurse used Neuroleaper to build a virtual health assistant for seniors with mobility challenges. These stories flooded Ruth's inbox, a testament to the hunger for purpose that lay dormant but never dead. Yet as the movement grew, so did the backlash. The Department of Government Efficiency had ramped up efforts to limit Neuroleaper's availability, citing unforeseen psychological risks and security vulnerabilities. New legislation proposed tighter controls on cognitive enhancement tools, fearing that elder empowerment might disrupt social hierarchies and strain public resources. At public hearings, the opposition portrayed elder innovation as a threat to societal stability, a narrative that rubbed painfully against Ruth's reality. She remembered the nights of loneliness, the whispered doubts that aging meant the end. Now, she saw the truth: those fears were not facts, they were chains, waiting to be broken. Determined not to be silenced, Ruth partnered with activists, scientists, and legal experts to challenge these restrictions. Together, they launched educational campaigns and legal petitions, demanding recognition of the rights of elders to access tools that could unlock their potential. The movement was no longer just about technology, it was about dignity, respect, and justice. Ruth also continued to share her story publicly, from small town halls to national conferences, each time reminding audiences that age is not a limit but a lens through which we see a world richer with experience. Meanwhile, Elon Musk remained a complicated figure in the background, his innovations enabling the movement, his political provocations stirring controversy. Ruth admired his relentless drive but also saw the cost: a polarized world struggling to balance fear and hope. In a rare interview, Musk himself acknowledged the challenge: we're disrupting systems built on old assumptions. It's uncomfortable, but necessary. The future belongs to those who refuse to be defined by the past. One crisp autumn morning, Ruth received an invitation that both thrilled and terrified her: a speaking engagement at the National Innovation Summit in Washington, D.C., a gathering of leaders, policymakers, and visionaries shaping the next decade. This was more than a platform, it was an opportunity to stand at the crossroads where fear met possibility, where resistance met revolution. She prepared meticulously, revisiting her journey, her fears, her victories. She knew her voice carried more than words. It carried the hopes of millions who had felt forgotten. On stage, under the bright lights and expectant eyes, Ruth shared not just her story but the stories of countless others, a chorus rising to reclaim relevance. She spoke of the quiet rebellions, the libraries reborn as creative sanctuaries, the bridges rebuilt between generations. She called on leaders to embrace change with courage, to dismantle the barriers of ageism that stifled innovation and human potential. The response was electric. Questions poured in, some skeptical, others inspired. Ruth answered with honesty, humility, and unshakable conviction. Afterward, a senior senator approached her, eyes gleaming. "You've given us all a lot to think about. Perhaps it's time we rethink what aging really means in America." That moment crystallized for Ruth the power of her journey, not just to change minds but to change systems. Back home, as leaves fell like golden whispers outside her window, Ruth felt a profound sense of peace. The path ahead was uncertain, the battles far from over. But the ripples she'd set in motion were growing, stretching outward, carrying a message of hope and transformation. She thought of the boy in the park, the dandelions in Carrie's hair, the snow melting into spring. Change, she realized, wasn't a lightning strike, it was the steady pulse of life, beating strong and steady in the hearts of those who refused to fade away. "We are not done," she whispered. "Not by a long shot." Ruth Harper sat quietly in her sunlit kitchen, the early morning light filtering through the curtains and casting a gentle glow on the worn wooden table where her laptop sat open. The world outside was waking up, birds calling softly, leaves rustling in a faint breeze, but inside, Ruth felt a storm gathering. The government's tightening grip on Neuraleaper had escalated overnight. New regulations had been announced that would restrict access to the cognitive enhancement technology to those under 65, citing health risks and societal instability. The news hit her like a punch to the gut. It was a direct challenge, a message that said, "Your mind, your dreams, your potential, they're a threat." The same threat that had lurked in the shadows of her life for decades was now staring her down in a headline. Fear prickled at the edges of her resolve. For a moment, she remembered the long nights filled with doubt and loneliness. The whisper in her mind that maybe she was too old, too fragile, too forgotten to fight back. But then she thought of Elon Musk's words, reverberating like a mantra, "You are the most underutilized technology on this planet." Ruth closed her eyes and felt the weight of those words settle in her chest like a steady flame. She wasn't alone. Across the country, thousands of elders were waking up to their own power, and this was their moment. She opened her laptop and began typing, pouring her fear and fury into a blog post that quickly went viral. "When fear meets courage," she wrote, "we are reminded that the future isn't owned by the young, but by those brave enough to claim it at any age." The post sparked conversations on social media, in newsrooms, and around kitchen tables. Voices that had long been silenced found strength in her words. Ruth connected with advocates, scientists, and caregivers, forming a coalition dedicated to fighting the restrictions. They called themselves the Ageless Alliance. It was a diverse group, artists and engineers, retirees and activists, all united by one purpose: to reclaim the narrative of aging as a time of possibility, not limitation. They organized webinars, petitions, and town hall meetings, challenging lawmakers to reconsider policies based on fear rather than facts. At one such town hall, Ruth spoke with calm conviction. "Our minds do not cease to matter at 65. Our stories, our creativity, our capacity to contribute, they all continue to evolve. The restrictions you impose are not protections, they are chains." The hearing was tense. Some lawmakers resisted, citing concerns about safety and the burden on healthcare systems. But Ruth's presence, her raw honesty, and the stories of others swayed many. Slowly, the tide began to turn. Meanwhile, the media frenzy around Elon Musk intensified. His dual role as innovator and provocateur kept the world's attention riveted. Some hailed him as a visionary breaking barriers, others condemned him as a reckless disruptor. Ruth found herself caught in the middle, both inspired by his fearlessness and wary of the chaos it sometimes unleashed. Yet beneath the headlines, something more profound was unfolding, a collective awakening to the potential of elder minds fueled by technology and courage. In quiet moments, Ruth reflected on her own journey, from a woman who once felt invisible and broken to someone who now stood as a beacon of hope. She remembered the boy in the park, the dandelions in Carrie's hair, the moment she first grasped that change was possible. She knew the battle ahead would be long, but she also knew that true courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. One evening, after a long day of calls and planning, Ruth received a message from an unexpected source. A young neuroscientist who had been researching the effects of Neuraleaper on elder cognition. His findings were hopeful, showing improvements in memory, creativity, and emotional resilience without the risks the government feared. Encouraged, Ruth shared the research with the Ageless Alliance and policymakers. Slowly, science began to shift the conversation. The walls of fear started to crack. As winter gave way to spring, Ruth felt a new energy pulsing through her veins. The quiet rebellion was becoming a movement that refused to let age define destiny. One afternoon, Carrie brought home a small bouquet of dandelions, the same bright yellow flowers that had once danced in her hair. Ruth held them close, feeling the warmth of new beginnings. "We're not done," she said softly. "Not by a long shot." Ruth Harper stood at the edge of a new frontier, a place where the familiar contours of her past collided with the uncharted possibilities of the future. The National Innovation Summit had been a turning point, but now the real work began, the hard, relentless push to bridge the gap between fear and acceptance, between old systems and new realities. For decades, society had viewed aging as a slow retreat from life's stage, a quiet fade into obscurity. But now, thanks to Neuraleaper and the movement it sparked, that narrative was breaking apart. The challenge was to bring others across that divide. Ruth's days were packed with meetings, phone calls, and video conferences. She collaborated with scientists refining Neuraleaper's technology, ensuring it was safe, accessible, and tailored to the unique needs of elders. She worked alongside activists lobbying Congress to repeal restrictive policies, sharing stories that humanized statistics and regulations. She mentored elders eager to learn, teaching them to embrace technology not as a threat but as a tool of empowerment. In the evenings, Ruth wrote letters to policymakers, essays for national publications, and posts for her blog that reached thousands. Her words were a steady drumbeat against the silence that had long enveloped aging. One evening, after a long day in Washington, D.C., Ruth found herself walking through a quiet neighborhood park. The trees were budding, the air crisp and alive with the scent of spring. She spotted a small group gathered near a bench. Elder men and women, some with canes, others with the spark of curiosity shining in their eyes. They were waiting for her. They had come from nearby retirement communities, eager to learn about Neuraleaper, to understand how this strange new technology could change their lives. Ruth smiled, feeling the weight of their hopes and fears. She sat down with them and began to speak, not as a lecturer, but as one who had walked the same path. She shared her story of doubt and rediscovery, of fear and courage, of a world that once told her she was too old but now had to reckon with the truth of her resilience. The group listened intently, their questions thoughtful and candid. How would Neuraleaper affect their memories? Could it help them reconnect with family? Was it safe? Ruth answered honestly, drawing on the latest research and her own experience. She spoke of Elon Musk's vision, the refusal to accept limits, and how that spirit could live in every one of them. Slowly, the walls of skepticism began to crumble. One woman, her silver hair tied in a loose bun, reached out and took Ruth's hand. "I've been afraid to try," she said softly. "But now, I want to believe." That moment was a quiet victory. It wasn't a headline or a policy win, it was the spark of transformation in a single heart. Back at home, Ruth often thought about the divide she had crossed, the gap between resignation and hope, between invisibility and voice. She knew many were still on the other side, trapped by fear or misinformation. That knowledge fueled her resolve. Technology was only part of the solution. The greater challenge was cultural, changing how a nation saw its elders, how elders saw themselves. Meanwhile, the political landscape was shifting. Influential lawmakers who had once opposed elder cognitive enhancement began to reconsider. The Ageless Alliance's persistent advocacy, backed by growing scientific evidence and public support, was making an impact. A bipartisan bill aimed at expanding access to Neuraleaper was introduced, with Ruth invited to testify before Congress. She prepared carefully, crafting a message that balanced passion with data, personal story with policy. The hearing was tense, marked by sharp questions and skeptical faces. But Ruth stood firm, her voice steady and clear as she spoke not just for herself, but for millions who had been sidelined by society's narrow definitions of worth. "We are not relics of the past," she declared. "We are architects of the future. Technology has the power to unlock our minds, but it's our courage that will unlock the world." The testimony received widespread media coverage, igniting debates across news channels, newspapers, and social platforms. The movement's momentum grew. At the same time, Elon Musk announced a new initiative, Neuraleaper 2.0, promising enhanced safety features and broader accessibility, including partnerships with community centers and healthcare providers. Ruth felt a mix of pride and caution. Musk's vision was a catalyst, but the work belonged to everyone willing to step into the light of possibility. One afternoon, Ruth received a video call from her daughter, Emma. Their relationship, once strained and distant, had softened in recent months. Emma shared stories of her own small victories, learning to code, starting a community garden, reconnecting with her father. They laughed and cried together, healing old wounds with the balm of shared hope. Ruth realized that crossing divides was not only about society or technology, it was about family, connection, and forgiveness. As spring turned to summer, Ruth's quiet revolution continued to spread. Libraries and senior centers hosted workshops, elders formed creative collectives, and stories of transformation poured in from every corner of the country. The narrative was shifting. Age was no longer a wall but a doorway. One evening, as Ruth walked through her garden, the scent of blooming jasmine heavy in the air, she reflected on how far she had come. The journey had been marked by fear, pain, and doubt, but also by hope, courage, and an unyielding refusal to fade away. Elon Musk's spark had ignited a fire inside her, and through her, a nation was beginning to see aging not as an end, but as a powerful beginning. Ruth smiled, feeling the pulse of change beneath her feet. The divide was not gone, but it was closing, step by step, heart by heart. And this time, she knew, no one would be left behind. Ruth Harper sat in the quiet corner of her favorite coffee shop, the faint hum of conversation around her barely registering as she stared at her laptop screen. The glow illuminated her weathered face, lined not just by time but by countless battles fought and won. Yet tonight, exhaustion weighed heavy on her shoulders. The movement she had helped ignite, the surge of hope and purpose among elders, was gaining momentum, but it came at a price far greater than she had anticipated. The government's crackdown on Neuraleaper intensified with each passing day. New regulations proposed severe penalties for unauthorized use, labeling the technology a dangerous disruption to public order. Propaganda campaigns subtly painted elder innovation as reckless, irresponsible, even selfish. Fearmongering headlines warned of senior citizens hacking their brains and a generation overstepping its bounds. Ruth read these articles with a sinking heart. The resistance was fierce, deeply rooted in societal anxieties about power, control, and the natural order. She recalled the sharp rebuke from her own son, David, who worried about the consequences of her defiance. "Mom, why risk it? You're pushing too hard. People aren't ready." That conversation haunted her. David's fears echoed the doubts she'd carried for years, the fear of being too old, too vulnerable, too alone. But she knew something had to change. The cost of silence was far greater. Ruth's activism made her a target. She received anonymous threats and hostile messages, warning her to stop or face consequences. Some friends drifted away, uncomfortable with the controversy swirling around her. She felt the sting of isolation, but also the fierce determination to press on. One cold evening, she was invited to speak at a small town hall in Ohio, where the local community was split over Neuraleaper's impact. The room was packed, tension thick enough to cut with a knife. As Ruth shared her story, a man in the back stood and challenged her openly. "You're messing with nature. This technology isn't safe. You're playing God." The accusation hit hard, but Ruth responded with calm clarity. "Isn't the true danger in accepting limits imposed by fear? We have the right to live fully, to grow, to innovate, not just as young people, but as elders too." Her words stirred murmurs, some nodding in agreement, others frowning in doubt. That night, Ruth understood that change would never be easy. It required confronting not just laws, but deep-seated beliefs and prejudices. Yet amidst the conflict, rays of hope pierced the darkness. A coalition of scientists released groundbreaking studies confirming Neuraleaper's safety and benefits for elder cognition. Media outlets began telling nuanced stories of seniors reclaiming their lives and creativity. And Ruth found unexpected allies, in younger generations inspired by her courage, in lawmakers moved by the human stories behind the statistics. Still, the personal toll was real. Ruth's health wavered under the pressure, sleepless nights and constant stress took their toll. Yet she refused to step back. She thought often of Elon Musk's relentless drive, his willingness to risk everything for a vision. She wasn't Musk, but she could be fearless in her own way. One evening, as she rested in her armchair, Carrie approached with a photo album. They flipped through images, moments frozen in time, birthdays, family trips, quiet mornings in the garden. Tears welled in Ruth's eyes. The years had not been kind, but love remained. It was a reminder that her fight was not just for herself, but for those she loved and the generations to come. In a rare moment of vulnerability, Ruth confided in Carrie. "I'm scared, sometimes. That all this will be for nothing. That the world isn't ready." Carrie squeezed her hand. "Mom, you've already changed the world for so many. Change isn't a straight line. It's messy and hard, but it's worth it. The words stayed with Ruth as she faced another day of advocacy, of public battles and private doubts. She realized that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to move forward despite it. And she was ready. The revolution of aging was not just about technology or laws, it was about breaking the chains of invisibility and reclaiming dignity. Ruth knew the road ahead would be long and rocky, but she was no longer walking it alone. Across the country, thousands stood with her, fueled by hope and the unyielding belief that it was never too late to change. And that belief, sparked by one woman's journey and the spark of a visionary, would ignite a future no government could contain. Ruth Harper's phone buzzed relentlessly, a steady stream of messages, calls, and notifications from allies, reporters, and curious strangers. The movement she had helped ignite was reaching a new crescendo, a moment she never quite dared to imagine. After months of struggle, of harsh backlash and creeping isolation, the tide was finally beginning to turn. It started with a single headline. A major national newspaper ran an in-depth feature on Neuraleaper and the growing community of elders defying stereotypes and reshaping their futures. The article was raw and honest, telling the stories of people who had rebuilt lives, healed relationships, and unlocked dormant dreams. Ruth's own journey was at the center, a beacon of hope and relentless courage. The piece struck a chord with readers across the country, sparking conversations and social media storms. Letters poured in from people who saw themselves in Ruth's story, those who had felt invisible, forgotten, or too old to change. The message was clear: transformation was possible, no matter the years behind you. At the same time, political winds began to shift. A growing number of lawmakers expressed support for the Ageless Alliance's cause, prompted by constituent pressure and the undeniable human stories that couldn't be ignored. Invitations to speak at congressional hearings multiplied. Ruth prepared carefully for these moments, knowing that each word had the power to sway opinion, to chip away at prejudice and fear. One particularly pivotal hearing brought together scientists, elder advocates, and policymakers to debate the future of Neuraleaper and elder empowerment. Ruth's testimony was moving, a blend of data and emotion, of facts and lived experience. She spoke not just for herself, but for the millions whose voices had been silenced for too long. This is not about technology alone, she said. It's about our right to grow, to create, to belong. To be seen as vital contributors, no matter our age. The room was silent as she finished, the weight of her words settling over everyone present. For the first time, many saw aging through a different lens, not as a decline but as an opportunity for reinvention. Outside the hearing room, reporters clamored for interviews, eager to capture this shifting narrative. Ruth found herself at the center of a national dialogue about aging, technology, and human potential. But alongside the spotlight came new challenges. The opposition remained vocal, wary of the social and economic implications of widespread cognitive enhancement among elders. Concerns about fairness, access, and unintended consequences were debated fiercely. Ruth welcomed these discussions, believing that transparency and accountability were essential. Yet she refused to let fear dictate the future. She and the Ageless Alliance proposed comprehensive safeguards and educational programs to ensure Neuraleaper's responsible use. As momentum built, Elon Musk made a surprise announcement. He would be funding a nationwide initiative to distribute Neuraleaper devices to elder centers, with support services to help users adapt and thrive. The news sent shockwaves through political and social circles. Musk's involvement lent the movement an undeniable boost, reinforcing the vision that age should never be a barrier to innovation. Ruth felt a mix of admiration and wariness. Musk was a force unlike any other, a catalyst for change but also a lightning rod for controversy. Still, his commitment was undeniable. One crisp spring morning, Ruth returned to the park where her journey had quietly begun. The same bench where she had met the curious boy now hosted a group of elders engaged in a lively discussion about technology and creativity. They greeted her warmly, sharing stories of newfound passions and rekindled dreams. Watching them, Ruth felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was the heart of the revolution. The simple, profound reclaiming of life's possibilities at every stage. Later that day, Ruth received a call from her son, David. Their conversations had grown more frequent, less tense. This time, he sounded hopeful. "Mom, I've been reading about everything you're doing. I'm proud of you. Maybe there's more for all of us yet." Tears welled in Ruth's eyes. Reconciliation was another form of transformation, a healing born of courage and patience. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in hues of gold and amber, Ruth sat on her porch and reflected on the journey. The cost had been high, the battles, the loneliness, the doubts. But the victories were sweeter because of it. She thought of Elon Musk's words, "The future belongs to those who refuse to be defined by the past." Ruth smiled, knowing that she and countless others were living proof. The turning point was not just a moment in time. It was a movement, a rising tide that would carry generations forward. And for the first time in a long time, Ruth Harper felt the exhilarating pulse of possibility coursing through her veins. The story of age was being rewritten, and she was proud to help author it. Ruth Harper stood outside the newly opened Ageless Innovation Center, a sleek glass building humming with quiet energy nestled in the heart of her small hometown. It was a place born from months of grassroots organizing, fundraising, and relentless determination, a tangible symbol of a movement that had once seemed impossible. Inside, elders gathered in bright rooms filled with computers, virtual reality stations, and tools to explore creativity and technology. The air buzzed with excitement and possibility. Ruth watched as a group of seniors collaborated on digital art projects, their laughter echoing against the high ceilings. Nearby, another circle experimented with coding exercises, pushing past fears and assumptions about age and ability. For Ruth, the center was a dream come true, not just a hub for learning, but a sanctuary where elders could reclaim their agency and rewrite their stories. The journey to this moment had been anything but easy. She remembered the early days, sitting alone in her living room, wrestling with self-doubt and exhaustion. The relentless pushback from officials, the skepticism of even her own family. Yet each setback had fueled a fire, a refusal to accept invisibility. Elon Musk's example had been a beacon, his willingness to break rules and challenge norms had inspired Ruth to do the same on her own scale. Now, as she toured the center, she felt a profound sense of connection to the people around her. They were not just participants, they were pioneers, reshaping the very definition of what it meant to grow older. One afternoon, a young volunteer named Jamie approached Ruth, holding a tablet displaying a prototype app designed to help elders access NeuroLeaper more intuitively. Jamie's enthusiasm was infectious, reminding Ruth of the bridge between generations that technology could build. "This is just the start," Jamie said with a smile. "Together, we're breaking down barriers." Ruth nodded, feeling a surge of hope. The center was more than a building, it was a community, a movement, a declaration that age was no boundary but a bridge. As word spread, the center became a model for other towns and cities, sparking a nationwide network of similar hubs. Elders connected with younger innovators, sharing wisdom and learning new skills. Families found renewed bonds as parents and children explored technology side by side. The cultural shift was palpable. In her quiet moments, Ruth often thought back to her earliest fears, the loneliness, the silence, the sense of being forgotten. Now, those feelings were replaced by a fierce joy. She received letters from people who had rediscovered passion, mended relationships, or launched new ventures. The world was opening in ways she had never imagined. Yet Ruth knew the work was far from over. There were still skeptics, still laws to change, still hearts to win over. The revolution of aging was ongoing, a continuous effort to dismantle outdated notions and build new possibilities. One evening, as Ruth sat in the center's cozy library, she was joined by a man named Tom, a retired engineer who had once dismissed NeuroLeaper as a fad. Tom shared his own story of transformation, How technology had rekindled his love of invention and given him a new purpose. "I thought my best days were behind me," he admitted. "But now, I'm building again. I'm alive in ways I never expected." Ruth smiled, feeling the power of that simple truth. The center was a place where hope grew, where bridges were built not just between generations, but within the souls of those who dared to dream again. As spring melted into summer, the movement continued to gain momentum. Media coverage celebrated the centers as beacons of possibility, and policymakers began integrating elder empowerment into broader social agendas. Ruth found herself mentoring new leaders, sharing lessons learned and encouraging boldness. The ripple effect was undeniable. One afternoon, Ruth received an unexpected invitation to meet Elon Musk in person. The meeting was surreal, a collision of worlds and generations. Musk's intensity was palpable, his gaze sharp yet thoughtful. They talked about vision, fear, and the future of human potential. "You're doing the hard work," he said, his voice steady. "Changing minds is the real innovation." Ruth felt a deep gratitude. Musk was the spark, but she and thousands like her were the flame, burning steady and strong. As she left the meeting, Ruth knew that the bridges they were building were not just for now, but for generations yet to come. The story of aging was no longer one of fading away, it was a story of crossing divides, embracing change, and forging a new legacy. And for Ruth Harper, that legacy was just beginning. Ruth Harper sat quietly in her small study, the walls lined with books and photographs that mapped the landscape of her life. Outside, the world moved fast, a world she had helped shift, inch by inch, from fear to possibility. Yet inside, she wrestled with a question that haunted many elders who dared to leap beyond convention: what comes next, when the mind and body begin to betray you in ways no technology can fully heal? The last frontier was no longer just about innovation or social acceptance, it was the intimate confrontation with mortality, the fragile boundary where hope meets reality. Over the years, Ruth's journey had been marked by victories and losses. She had regained purpose, rekindled relationships, and inspired countless others. But age had also brought new challenges, aches in joints that no exercise could fully ease, moments when memory faltered despite Neuraleaper's enhancements, and the quiet solitude of nights spent awake with worry. One autumn evening, after a long day at the Ageless Innovation Center, Ruth received troubling news from her doctor. Routine tests showed signs of early-stage Alzheimer's, a cruel irony for someone who had dedicated her life to fighting cognitive decline. The diagnosis hit like a thunderclap, shaking her to her core. Fear and denial surged within her. How could she face losing the very mind she had fought so hard to protect? For days, Ruth withdrew into herself, battling despair. She avoided calls, silenced messages, and let the world spin without her. But then, a single thought broke through the fog: Elon Musk's words, "The future belongs to those who refuse to be defined by the past." She realized that this new challenge was not an end, but another frontier to cross. Ruth reached out to Carrie and David, opening up about her fears and hopes. Their response was a balm, a reminder that she was not alone. Together, they began exploring treatments, therapies, and support networks. Ruth embraced the advances that Neuraleaper 3.0 now offered, adaptive algorithms designed to assist with memory recall and emotional support. The technology could not cure her, but it could help her navigate the shifting terrain. In the community she had helped build, Ruth found strength and solidarity. Elders facing their own health battles shared stories, strategies, and hope. They became each other's lifelines, proving that even in vulnerability, there was power. Ruth also turned inward, embracing mindfulness and reflection. She began keeping a journal, words flowing like a river, capturing fears, gratitude, dreams, and moments of clarity. Writing became her anchor, a way to chart the unknown waters ahead. One afternoon, as Ruth sat in the garden, the scent of chrysanthemums heavy in the air, she was joined by Tom, the retired engineer she had met months before. Tom, too, faced health challenges, and their shared experiences forged a deeper bond. They spoke openly about fear, acceptance, and the courage to keep moving forward. "We're not alone," Tom said softly. "And neither are those who come after us. Our stories matter." Ruth nodded, feeling a fierce tenderness. The movement they had sparked was not just about extending life or cognition, it was about embracing the full spectrum of human experience, including vulnerability and mortality. As winter approached, Ruth's health fluctuated. There were days when the fog thickened, memories slipping away like grains of sand. But there were also moments of brilliant lucidity, times when laughter returned, connections deepened, and purpose shone through the haze. In those moments, Ruth understood that the true revolution was not about defying death, but about choosing how to live in its shadow. One evening, Ruth received a message from Elon Musk himself, a brief note acknowledging her courage and resilience. It was a reminder that even the boldest visions rested on human hearts and stories. Ruth shared the message with Carrie and David, a symbol of the bridge between visionary ideas and lived reality. As she prepared for another day, Ruth looked out the window at the rising sun. The path ahead was uncertain, marked by challenges no technology could erase. But she was ready to face it, with grace, with strength, and with the unyielding belief that every moment, no matter how fragile, held the potential for meaning and connection. The last frontier was no longer a place of fear. It was a place of fierce, beautiful humanity. The autumn air was crisp and golden as Ruth Harper stood at the podium, facing a crowd gathered in the town square for the annual Ageless Festival, a celebration born from the movement she had nurtured over the years. The festival was alive with music, laughter, and vibrant colors, a testament to a community that refused to fade into the background of society. Ruth's heart swelled with pride and a bittersweet mix of emotions. She was no longer the isolated woman who once doubted her place in the world. Now, she was a symbol of resilience and transformation, a living proof that age was a gateway, not a barrier. As she looked out at the faces in the crowd, elders, families, young people inspired by the journey, she felt a profound connection. This was more than a festival, it was a movement in motion, a legacy taking shape. Ruth's speech was brief but powerful. She spoke of struggle and hope, of fear and courage. She reminded everyone that the true gift of aging was the chance to redefine what mattered. "We are the authors of our stories," she said, her voice steady and warm. "No matter our age, no matter our challenges, we can choose to live with purpose and passion. This is our time." The crowd erupted in applause, and Ruth felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming sense of belonging and accomplishment. After the speech, Ruth wandered through the festival, greeting friends old and new. She paused by a booth where a young woman named Mia was showcasing a project that combined art and technology to help elders tell their stories. Mia's enthusiasm was infectious, and Ruth felt a deep gratitude for the next generation carrying the torch. Later, Ruth sat quietly by the fountain, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. The battles, the breakthroughs, the moments of doubt and triumph. Her thoughts drifted to Elon Musk's influence, not just the technology he had championed, but the mindset he embodied, bold, relentless, unafraid to challenge convention. That mindset had sparked a revolution in her own life and in the lives of countless others. As dusk settled, Ruth was joined by Carrie and David, who had become integral parts of her world once more. Together, they talked about the future, the ongoing work to ensure that every elder had access to the tools and community to thrive. They dreamed of expanding the ageless innovation centers, of influencing policy, of changing hearts across the nation. Ruth knew there would always be challenges ahead, but the foundation was strong. She realized that legacy was not about what you leave behind when you're gone, but what you build while you're here, connections, hope, transformation. In the quiet of the evening, Ruth took out her journal and began to write. Her words flowed with clarity and passion, a message for those who would come after her. "I was never too old to change, to grow, to matter. And neither are you. The future is waiting, bold, bright, and unbounded." As she closed the journal, Ruth felt a deep peace. Her story was part of something greater, a living, breathing movement that would continue long after she was gone. The legacy was in motion, and it was unstoppable. The world was watching. News networks buzzed with breaking headlines as governments scrambled to respond to the sweeping impact of Elon Musk's latest invention, Neuraleaper. The device, once dismissed as a niche innovation, had evolved into a transformative force redefining aging and human potential. Ruth Harper found herself at the center of this global reckoning, the face of a movement that had challenged deeply rooted fears and societal norms. In the halls of power, debates raged fiercely. Lawmakers argued over regulations, ethical boundaries, and the future of cognitive enhancement. Some saw Neuraleaper as a threat, a destabilizing force that could upend social order, strain healthcare systems, and exacerbate inequalities. Others championed it as a breakthrough that could unlock decades of vitality, creativity, and contribution. Ruth attended hearings alongside scientists, elder advocates, and tech leaders. The atmosphere was tense, charged with uncertainty and high stakes. Yet beneath the political theater, she sensed a profound shift, a growing acknowledgement that the old paradigms were crumbling. Ruth remembered the early days of doubt and isolation, the whispers that she was chasing a foolish dream. Now, those whispers had transformed into a chorus of voices demanding change, inclusion, and respect for elders as vital members of society. In one particularly pivotal moment, Ruth delivered a speech that echoed across the chambers and into millions of homes. "This is not about technology alone," she declared. "It's about recognizing the value and potential within each of us, regardless of age. It's about building a future where no one is left behind, where innovation serves humanity's deepest needs." The speech sparked both applause and controversy, fueling debates that spilled into everyday conversations worldwide. As tensions mounted, governments issued new guidelines to ensure equitable access and ethical oversight of Neuraleaper technology. At the same time, community-driven initiatives flourished, empowering elders to shape the conversation and the future they desired. Ruth's personal life mirrored the upheaval. The demands of advocacy weighed heavily, yet she found solace in the growing network of allies and friends. Carrie and David stood by her side, their bond stronger than ever. Together, they navigated the challenges of public life and private vulnerability, discovering new depths of love and resilience. Late one night, Ruth received a call from Elon Musk. His tone was unusually somber, reflecting the gravity of the moment. "This is bigger than any of us imagined," he said. "But you're leading the way. Keep pushing. The world needs this." Ruth drew strength from his words, renewing her commitment to the cause. The moment of reckoning was a crucible, a test of courage, vision, and humanity. In the weeks that followed, Ruth traveled across the country, sharing stories, listening to fears, and inspiring hope. She saw firsthand the power of community and the urgency of inclusion. The revolution was not just technological, it was deeply human. As the dust settled on this pivotal chapter, Ruth understood that the journey was far from over. But the foundations had been laid. The future belonged to those who dared to envision a world where age was not a limitation, but a wellspring of wisdom and possibility. And in that truth, Ruth Harper found her greatest hope. Ruth Harper stood at the edge of the town's overlook, the sun dipping low behind the rolling hills, casting a warm amber glow over the horizon. The sky was painted with hues of orange and violet, a breathtaking reminder that endings were often the threshold of new beginnings. In her hand, she held a worn leather-bound journal, its pages filled with stories of struggle, triumph, fear, and hope, her legacy captured in ink. The journey that had once felt impossible was now a living, breathing reality. Ruth breathed deeply, feeling the crisp evening air fill her lungs and steady her heart. She thought about everything she had faced, the loneliness, the setbacks, the doubts whispered by a society that too often wrote off those who aged. She remembered the moment Elon Musk's words sparked a fire within her, the quiet resolve that grew into a movement. It had never been just about technology. It was about reclaiming identity, purpose, and connection in a world that too often tried to erase them. As the stars began to twinkle, Ruth reflected on the people who had walked this path with her, the friends who became family, the young innovators who believed in possibility, the elders who dared to hope again. Together, they had shifted the tide, proving that age was not a cage but a key. Suddenly, her phone buzzed, a message from Carrie, simple but profound: "Your story is changing the world. We're just getting started." Ruth smiled, a deep, genuine smile that reached her eyes. She typed back, "I was never too old. I was just waiting for permission to matter again." The phrase lingered in the cool night air, a declaration not just of her own journey, but a call to anyone who felt left behind, forgotten, or powerless. The world was changing fast. Governments had adapted, creating policies that recognized the rights and potential of elders. Communities across the nation and beyond had embraced innovation centers like the one Ruth had founded, sparking a renaissance of creativity and empowerment. Neuroleaper and its successors were no longer tools of controversy but bridges to fuller, richer lives. Yet Ruth knew the true revolution was ongoing. It lived in each person who chose to rise, to challenge, to create anew, regardless of age or circumstance. She thought of her grandchildren, their bright eyes filled with wonder and possibility. She thought of the legacy she wanted to leave, not just for them, but for all who would come after. The night deepened, stars blazing like distant fires. Ruth closed her journal and looked up, feeling a profound sense of peace. The future was uncertain, as all futures are. But it was hers to shape. Her story was not an ending, but a beginning. And in that, she found boundless hope. As the first light of dawn crept over the hills, Ruth whispered a final truth: "We are never too old to change the world." The new beginning had arrived, and it was glowing brighter than ever. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?